want to welcome you to Psychology 421 Psychology Testing Measurements Test 1 review slides. I want to make it very clear that these slides are not presented as an inclusive listing of everything that's going to be on the test. They are drawn from the original longer lectures, class lectures, and of course the textbook, and the test will draw from all these sources. The study guide that is presented on Blackboard gives you a good idea of anything that might be tested on the test, including things you need to know, formulas you need to know how to use, terms that you need to know the definitions of. My intention with these slides is to provide you a fairly brief overview of some of the more complex concepts, or concepts I think may be a little bit harder to understand from just reading through the slides. So again, like I said, each one of these will be a shortened version, collapsed slides, 5 or 6, 7, 8 slides, where I'm just going to kind of briefly go over some of those core concepts, hopefully to help you study. So as just a reminder, we started out with what is a psychological measurement, and again, psychological measurement is the assessment of individual differences in personal experiences. And that's the big part of this, is that when we're talking about psychological measurement, we're talking about two general broad areas of constructs. Individual differences, and those are generally going to be considered to be stable traits, and personal experiences or personal attitudes. So we can be measuring characteristics, attitudes, mental health, also behaviors. So using behavioral methods, how often someone does something, how many drinks you have in a night, responses to situations, so how people respond to situations in order to conduct additional studies, and assimilation of experiences environments, in other words, gaining of knowledge and learning. Now, we do have to make the distinction between states and traits. We are interested in measuring both. However, most of the techniques we talk about in this class are more appropriate for measuring traits, something that is stable, and therefore we can check for reliability, we can check for validity using statistical techniques. When we're measuring a state, something that can change from moment to moment, anger, happiness, those are a little bit more difficult to actually validate and to find out if they're reliable or not, because one of the assumptions that we make when we're validating a psychological measure is that we're measuring a stable construct, and that's, of course, a trait. Just as a reminder, again, the objective of testing is typically to obtain some gauge, usually numerical in nature, with regard to an ability or attribute. So basically, we're testing to put numbers and ratings. We're wanting to classify people. And in addition to finding out if a measure that we're using is reliable, we get the same result multiple times in some way. Valid, it's actually measuring what we're expecting it to measure. We also want to make sure that we're getting variability in our testing. In other words, we want to be able to distinguish between top performers, medium performers, and bottom performers on whatever that trait is, or the people that have less of the trait, a moderate amount of the trait, or more of the trait. So we're testing not just for the purposes of trying to quantify human psychology, we're usually testing to make decisions. So in educational settings, to determine how well someone's learning material, in clinical settings, trying to determine how much someone is suffering or not suffering from various psychopathology, and in industrial settings or organizational settings, trying to determine if someone has the necessary skills to be successful at the job. So the objective of assessment is now to take that testing to typically answer a referral question to solve a problem or derive a decision through the tools of evaluation. So testing is the process of actually assigning numbers to a construct. Assessment is using that test to then make a decision. And when making a decision, we're often looking at some form of reference point, often referred to as a cut score. It's usually a numerical level, and it's used to divide data into 2 or more classifications. For example, the cut score in an average class is based on a 0 to 100%. If you have 100% of the points down to 90% of the points, 90% is the cut score for an A, 80% is the cut score for a B, and so on. Other ways of classifying tests, just as a quick review again, is that when we're talking about what type of test or measure we're using, we've got a fair amount of things we want to think about. So are we wanting a paper and pencil test, or are we wanting a performance test? So paper and pencil also includes online testing, but basically another way to think of paper and pencil is it's generally self-report. It's something that you can fill out on your own time and your own schedule. It just requires either you to have the test and to take it, like the test in a class, or to fill out either on your own time, physically, or maybe online. A performance test, in contrast, is actually a behavioral observation of the performance. So if I wanted to know if you knew how to give a public speech, I could give you a test with questions of what is the best practices in giving a speech. That would be a paper and pencil test. But if I really wanted to find out, can you give a speech, I'd want to have you give one and rate your performance. We can also look at whether the test is speed or power. So most of our tests are actually power tests. And that means that you're being given enough time that the average person should be able to complete the test without having to be too rushed. A speed test, by contrast, is when there are more questions or items in the test than it would be possible to actually finish in time. So a power test, a good example of that would be an actual test in a class. You're usually given an hour and 15 minutes, and the test is usually scheduled or designed, if you will, to be around 30 to 45 minutes to take that test. A speed test would be, for example, a typing test for how much can you type, words typed in a minute. That's a speed test. So it's just as many as you can get done in a set amount of time. And again, depending on what you're using the test for is whether you'd want to use a power or speed test. If you're trying to test for something that is going to be in the real world, having to make quick decisions under pressure and under a time constraint, then a speed test is going to be more predictive than a power test. You want to also ask is, can the test be given individually or as a group? So can multiple people be taking the test on the whole time? And usually group tests are tests that don't require a lot of personal supervision. Individual tests are tests that generally have to be administered one person at a time, which usually also means there has to be someone administering that test and making sure that it's done correctly. So, for example, a performance test may be giving a speech in front of a panel of 3 judges. That would also be then an individual test. One person gives the performance and the graders rate the performance. While a pen and paper test on speech taking that you take, 10 questions, true or false, would be a paper and pencil test that could be taken in a group. We also want to ask if the test is actually measuring maximum performance or typical performance. So maximum performance basically means that you are being allowed to do your very, very best. So it's an optimal situation for good performance. You know you're being observed, you're going to do your very best. A job interview is usually a good example of maximum performance. You know you're supposed to be doing a good job. Typical performance, though, is usually gathered over a longer period of time. So, for instance, if I'm having you give a speech in front of a class, and you have weeks to prepare, and you have access to resources to make sure the speech is good, you rewrite it, you practice it, and then finally you give that 15-minute speech. That's an example of maximum performance. However, if you have to give a speech every day and you're not getting to prepare each time, and I watch every one of those performances, so I watch your speech on Monday, your speech on Tuesday, your speech on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I'm more likely to actually getting at your typical performance in speech giving. And finally, we need to ask how we're actually going to use that test, and that's norm referenced versus criterion referenced. So norm reference means that we're just comparing your scores to norms. We're actually looking to see just how you compared relative to other people. So in a class, norm referenced would be to say you're in the top 10%, or you had the highest score in a class. That's referring to where your score refers to the normal performance in that test. Criterion referenced is back to that cut score. So you got an A. And there is a difference between norm referenced and criterion referenced. So you got an A, if I give a test to everyone and everyone scores between a 90 and 100, well, the criterion reference means that everyone got an A, everyone has the same score. The norm reference, though, would be comparing your score to everyone else's score. So if you got a 90 and you're the only person that got that 90, everyone else scored higher, even though everyone got an A, you're actually in the bottom 1% of performance. So again, just 2 different ways to look at the same score. We talked briefly about the history of measurement. We kind of talked about how the first actual recorded history of psychological measurement was actually done by the Chinese government approximately 2,000 plus years ago using tests for civil service. And we actually have both records of some of those tests and also art and representations that this was being done. And actually, the Chinese were very fond of creating tests to determine who should actually get into the bureaucracy of their early governments. We also kind of talked about how Plato and Aristotle kind of set up the nature versus nurture argument, with Plato saying everything was internal, Aristotle everything external. Plato saying you have to look inward to determine what's going on, and Aristotle saying you need to observe the external environment to know what's going on. And these are two things that still resonate in psychology to this day. The idea that sometimes we are using introspection, people's own evaluation of their internal thoughts, and a lot of self-reports are that way. So when I report what kind of personality I have, I'm looking inward, I'm evaluating myself, and then I'm providing information. However, an external viewpoint is more of when someone observes my behavior and makes a determination of what they think my actual personality is. Both of these have strengths and weaknesses, and we tend to try to use both techniques in psychological tests and measures. Modern history of measurement starts in the 1800s, and this really starts with Darwin. And Darwin's Origin of Species is very important because it got people thinking about individual differences and how certain individual differences increase the likelihood of an individual creature passing on its genes, and other individual differences make it less likely. So basically, taking Darwin's opinions and Darwin's theory of evolution, we also have an extrapolation that we should start to be looking at people, individuals, and trying to quantify their differences, to take a look at who is, quite honestly, better at various tasks. And this is what kind of started the measurement movement, for good or ill. We talked briefly about some of the other psychologists that had impact, but the next one I really want to touch on briefly is Francis Galton. Really the founder of psychological testing, and again, he was a direct disciple of Darwin's. He studied heredity of intelligence, and he was the first person to truly try to measure human abilities, and he was looking at ways to quantify basically top performers from bottom performers in key human traits, mainly intelligence. James McKeen Cattell, first person to come up with what he called a mental test. Again, he studied under Galton, so Darwin to Galton to McKeen Cattell. And he tried to relate ability to scholastic achievement. So basically, he was trying to come up with measures of mental ability that would then also relate to other measures of success in academia. So he's the first person that's really starting to kind of look at some of the modern techniques that we talked about later in the class as far as validation. The early 1900s, we have Alfred Binet and also Theodore Simon, mainly Binet, came up with the Binet-Simon intelligence scale. So this is the first successfully developed scale to not only measure or attempt to measure the construct of cognitive ability or mental ability, but it also had a strong relationship with academic achievement, specifically for children. Charles Spearman was the founder of measurement theory. So basically, we start to see the methodology that we've been talking in this class, different ways to actually ask, is this measure reliable? Is this measure valid? He's also the person that came up with factor analysis, a statistical technique to look for latent variables that are being captured by a whole series of questions. Pretty much, other than that, it's important to note that during World War I, we have the first group intelligence tests being actively used by organizations to make selection decisions. So again, this is the first time we're seeing testing really moving into that assessment. Now decisions are being made on these tests. And that was primarily in the United States, the Army's Alpha and Beta tests that all the new recruits were taking. And we basically see, as World War I ends, a widespread use of at least intelligence testing in the 1920s. But it also is when people started to really question, are these tests truly getting at intelligence or not? The main advancements in the late 1900s is computers being used to allow to make tests much easier to take, the internet allowing testing to be very widely distributed to various people, and also further development of our theories and tools for testing the success of our measures, including item response theory. And again, we haven't really talked ever about item response theory in one slide. Almost all of what we've been discussing in this class is parts of item response theory. The measurement of items to see if they're consistent, the measurement of items to see if they're related to other items, the measurement of items to make sure that they are reliably measuring the same variable. All of these are a part of this broad umbrella of item response theory. We also briefly touched on the idea that with computers, we also have the idea of computer adaptive testing, which means that you can establish a test now that basically each answer is dependent on your previous success or failure. So if you get a medium level question wrong, you're actually given an easier question. And if you get that one wrong, an even easier question. But if you get a medium level question right, you're given a more difficult question. And if you get that one right, a more difficult question. And this allows for us to be able to classify people as top performers, medium performers, and bottom performers with much less tests. So instead of having to give someone all 100 questions, medium questions, easy questions, and hard questions, someone that's really good at math can basically be classified as good at math with about 5 questions. Right answer, right answer, right answer, and they've just answered all of the harder questions. At that point, there's no real need to give them the easier questions. At least that's the theory behind computer adaptive testing.